Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Episode 51, My Birb of the Year 2020. This podcast is supported by our amazing patrons. If you want to support Hans, go to patreon.com/history Aotearoa. Yes, it is that time of year again, time for Bird of the Year. Probably the most hotly anticipated election every year, in fact, because they do it yearly, not 3 years like they do with actual real people elections, like they are now, or at least have done when you're going to hear this. I'm recording this on election day, so, a fair way in advance. Reason for that is because if you are a patron, you are going to hear this a bit, a few weeks earlier. If you're a regular listener, you will hear this a little bit, you'll hear this during when the voting is open. And reason for that is because this is, kind of technically meant to be a Patreon episode, because that's what I did last year. As last year it was kind of a publicly available Patreon episode to kind of kick off the episodes on there that you have to pay money for to get them. And we have not done as many as I would have liked. I will admit I've not been quite as good as I would have wanted. However, I think we can all agree that everyone deserves a bit of slack this year, given everything that has happened. So I do apologise for not getting as much out as I perhaps wanted, but, I think you can hopefully forgive me slightly. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with what the hell kind of episode this is and why I'm talking about it, we'll start with the fact of why I personally want to talk about this, and that is because I do work in conservation. I do work, trying to protect our native species and that kind of stuff. So I do have an interest, and I do have a reasonable amount of knowledge about, New Zealand endemic and native species. So it's it's something that is I do have a knowledge of, that is not history, but I do have a bit of a background in it, and it's just something that I'm interested in as well. And of course, New Zealand has a lot of really interesting and unique endemic and native species. So it's part of kind of who we are as a nation and that kind of stuff. It's all partially intertwined into that kind of thing, as well as Māori culture and that kind of stuff as well. So it's all kind of vaguely relevant to history. It's also just kind of interesting, so there's that too. As for what Bird of the Year itself is, it is a kind of election, a vote thing, opinion poll, however you want to put it. It is a thing that Forest and Bird, who are a kind of a community group or a volunteer organisation here in New Zealand, that are all about protecting our native species and that kind of stuff, and they hold it every year to see who's the best bird every year, basically. So it's just a cool little thing. You can vote wherever you are in the world, so you don't have to be in New Zealand. You can vote as many times as you like, I think, as long as you've got an email address or something, like a different email address. I'm not quite sure how it works. You could probably go ask them, or just go look it up. There'll be a link in the description or whatever, the show notes, as to how you can vote. So it's just a thing that we sometimes do every year, and it gets very hotly contested. It gets very heated in the between everyone who's picking who they're gonna vote for and why and that kind of stuff. And so I just want to bring a bit of attention to one particular bird, so that we can all learn a bit more about it. Hopefully you can vote for it, and as well as the fact that it's a bit of an advertisement for the Patreon. If you want to hear more of this kind of stuff, you can go pay money on the Patreon. Link in the show notes as well. So there's that too. Or if you don't want to do that, you can just listen to this and the one from last year. So there's that too. And the other thing we should probably mention, if you haven't figured it out already, is that this is going to be a bit more of an informal sort of episode. It's obviously not me reading off a script, which is what I normally do, and it stops me from going on tangents and saying words weird and all that kind of stuff. So it will be a bit more informal. There will be some ums and ahs, as you've already heard. There will be probably some tangents where I just go on a bit of a rant or a bit of a side note, that kind of stuff. But also it does mean that there will be some swears potentially throughout. It does mean we are going to talk about bird breeding. That's not your deal if you don't want to talk about animals having sex and trying to have kids and all that kind of stuff. That's fine, but that is a part of what animals do, and it's also a very interesting part of what animals do, so we are going to talk about that because we do love bird sex here at Hans. Sounds a bit weird when I say it out loud, particularly just on my own. Anyway, so moving on. See, we're already off to a really, really bad start. But anyway, so let's start talking about the animal. So what it is the Chatham Island black robin, which its scientific name is Petroica traversii. Petroica traversii. We're gonna go with that. I don't know how to pronounce this one, so we're gonna guess that. But we're gonna call it the Chatham Island black robin, or just black robin for short, or just robin. Maybe. Anyway, these guys are endemic to New Zealand, and they are actually endemic to a very specific part of New Zealand, which is funnily enough, the Chatham Islands, which is a series of islands that are about 800 kilometres east of the South Island, so what they call mainland New Zealand. So they're only found on the Chatham Islands. They're actually only found on specific islands in that little, I don't know if you call it an archipelago, but that little island group. They're only found on a few different islands there, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But they're only found in this very specific area of New Zealand. And so the other thing you're probably wondering is, why did I choose the Chatham Island black robin, apart from all the cool, interesting facts that we're going to talk about? And that's because the Chatham Island black robin is New Zealand's conservation story. It is the conservation story. It is anyone who works in conservation, or anyone who is even remotely interested in New Zealand conservation, knows the story of the Chatham Island black robin. It is our most famous conservation story of bringing a species back from the brink, like the literal brink. It's just so famous. Like, even people overseas know this story. It is that famous, and it's kind of one of the reasons why you will sometimes, or at least if you're in the business of conservation and that kind of stuff, you will sometimes hear when people go overseas, or when New Zealanders go overseas to do conservation work and species recovery and that kind of stuff, they'll say, oh, where are you from, or whatever, and they go, I'm from New Zealand, and they go, oh, wow, like, whoa, like, it's a real big deal that they're from New Zealand and that they work in conservation. Like, it gives you, it kind of gives you a air of authenticity and, like, I guess respect or something. Like, you're immediately already kind of better than perhaps what they initially thought, in the sense that, like, if you're like I don't even know what comparison this would be. I guess, like, if you're Russian and you make vodka, like, it's immediately assumed that your vodka is better. Or if you're, like, I don't know, if you're French, you're better at, like, I don't know, loving or something. Like, you get what I mean, right? Like, you're immediately just, like, people think you're a lot better and just a lot higher of you in that regard, because New Zealand has, some really great stories and some really great experience and track record of species recovery and that kind of stuff. The other kind of major one obviously being the kakapo, but yeah, this one is the other really, really big one. So that's why I kind of chose it, is because I want to tell that story. So there is gonna be a bit of history in this, actually. So it's not fully unrelated. There is going to be a little bit of history in this. But before we get to all of that sort of stuff, we do have a bit of a process that we go through. There's some points that we're going to hit, which is what we normally do in these episodes. And the first thing that we normally touch on is the NZTCS, which is the New Zealand Threat Classification System. Because, of course, basically everything in New Zealand that is native or endemic is some degree of endangered or thereabouts. So that system is basically just a way to classify how endangered something is, from not threatened at all to vulnerable to nationally critical, or anything like that. So it's meant to be a way to kind of give a general idea of how well a species is doing, or how close a species is to extinction, or how not close they are to extinction. So the Chatham Island black robin is nationally critical, which is on its own doesn't really make any, it probably doesn't mean anything, but it sounds kind of bad, and that's because it is pretty bad. It is one step above extinct. So, it's the lowest rung on the list, just above extinct. So it's not doing super well in the kind of grand scheme of things, but as we'll see, there's a lot of effort being put into them. They're certainly a lot better than what they used to be. So although that is really bad, it is also, in a sense, really good. So, yeah, but we'll get to that, as I said, later. But, of course, you probably want to know what they look like, because, that you just know that they're a small black robin, or I'm guessing you think they're a small black robin, because that's what robins are like. So specifically, they are a small, rotund songbird. And rotund is not my word. This was the word that came from New Zealand Birds Online, which is where a lot of this information has come from, as well as Doc and a couple of other places as well. But rotund was not my word, but I put it in there because I thought it was great. It really does describe how they look, these kind of small, kind of round birds. And the reason that they look quite rotund is because they hold their head kind of hunched close to their body, so kind of like, I guess kind of how you do when you're trying to give yourself extra chins or whatever, when you're trying to do a funny face when you're doing a selfie kind of thing. You kind of suck your neck in a bit to your shoulders. I guess that's what they're doing permanently, so it makes them look a bit more kind of rotund. And so their size is kind of between a tomtit and other New Zealand robins, and kind of its size and its shape and its form and that kind of stuff. Which again, for a lot of you, probably doesn't mean much, but it's, I guess, medium-sized-ish for a robin, I guess. So it weighs about 22 to 25 grams, depending on the gender and that kind of stuff, and it's about 15 centimeters in length. Which, it's biggish, I guess. And both sexes are totally black at all ages, though juveniles do have a subtle pale streaking on the crown. So, there's not really a whole lot of difference between the sexes. They both look pretty identical to a casual observer. From what I understand, you do have to actually, handle them and that kind of stuff to actually figure out what the sex of each bird is. So there's no real way that you can just look at it and go, that's a male or a female, because the males don't have flashy colours or anything like that. Say, for example, compared to the hihi that we talked about last year, the male is kind of this black and yellow and kind of white kind of bits and stuff. These guys don't have any of that. They're all basically all black all the time, except for when they're juveniles, obviously. So their closest relations are, of course, other Petrioca species, which is the tomtit, which is its te reo Māori name is meromero, and the North and South Island robins, which are tautauwai, which, makes sense. They're all in the same genus, so they're all closely related. There's also the Chatham Island tomtit, which is another species of tomtit that is only found on the Chatham Islands, and that crosses the same range as the Chatham Island black robin as well, which is going to be important later on. And all of these are descended from Petrioca ancestors originating in Australia. So I couldn't find much else on that point, but I think I did mention it in some of the early episodes, where some bird species in New Zealand did originally fly over from Australia when the New Zealand landmass broke off from Australia. So I'd say that's probably where they're from, is they're Australian species that flew over to New Zealand, and then as New Zealand kind of moved further and further away, they kind of got stuck here, essentially. So their calls, they have a kind of a limited range of calls, actually. They don't have quite a lot of different kind of noises that they can make compared to other birds, because their songs generally consist of 4 to 5 clear notes, mainly by males. The females don't do as much singing. And they're not quite as melodic as mainland robins. Again, not my words, but that's what is apparently they said. They're not quite as melodic as mainland robins. So that's unfortunate. But yeah, there's that. And both sexes give a simple downscale call, potentially as a territorial act, to try and stop, or basically try and stop other individuals from getting in their territory and telling them, hey, this is my area, get out, kind of thing. And a single high-pitched note may indicate alarm or aggression. But that's all well and good, telling you what they sound like. But you want to hear them, right? This is an audio medium. You want to be able to hear them. So here is a couple of calls taken from New Zealand Birds Online. Oh, amazing. I don't know what they mean by they're not quite as melodic as mainland robins. But anyway, so what do they eat? Well, they are exclusively insectivores, which, as you might imagine, means that they eat insects. They eat all sorts of different insects at all sort of life stages. So things from spiders, which are, to be fair, not insects, flies, weta, worms, which are also not insects, beetles, moths, cockroaches, and caterpillars. So they eat a whole variety of different bugs and stuff from the ground and that kind of thing. So these guys forage diurnally, which is a weird word that some of you may not have heard of. But basically it means that they forage during the day. They're diurnal, right? As opposed to being nocturnal, like kiwis are. Nocturnal obviously meaning that they come out and are active during the night. Diurnal means they come out and are active during the day. So they forage diurnally in sub-story vegetation and on the ground, usually pouncing from like low branches. So they kind of get on a branch and they'll jump down and like grab the bug or whatever that they've found. Or they sometimes flick over leaf litter with their bills. But, some stuff is a bit big for them. They're not a huge bird. So larger prey items, like weta, are thrashed against objects first to remove the limbs and make them a bit more easily, eaten, I guess, and so they don't fight back as much. So that's pretty metal. Just thrashing bugs against, like, trees and rocks and stuff, I guess. So that's pretty cool. And unlike mainland robins, they don't store foods. They don't have like a little storehouse or whatever, I guess, of food that they keep for whatever reason. And so where do they live? So as mentioned before, they're only found on the Chatham Islands, which, again, as we mentioned before, is about 800 kilometres east of the South Island. And they originally inhabited 5 of the islands, which are Chatham Island itself, which is the big kind of main island, as well as Pitt Island, or Rangiaotea, as it's also known, Southeast, or Rangatira Island, Mangere Island, and Little Mangere Island, which is going to get a little bit confusing because, there's Mangere and Little Mangere, because they sit next to each other, so that's kind of why they're named like that. We'll try and not make that as confusing as possible. But unfortunately, they're not found on all of those islands anymore. Human activities destroyed all the populations except for the one on Little Mangere Island, which ended up consisting of 18 individuals in 1972. So 18 individuals in 1972, which is fuck all when it comes to, species recovery and breeding and all that kind of stuff. So it was really bad. And this population was further reduced to 7 individuals in 1976. So, 4 years later, they lost more than half of that population, which is, again, just atrocious. It's just, that is not what you want to see, obviously. And so in that same year, all of those individuals, all 7 of them, were moved to Mangere Island. So they were moved from Little Mangere to Mangere, the bigger one. And as of, the modern day, they're only found on Mangere and Rangatira Islands, the two islands that sit next to Pitt Island or Rangiora, which is southeast of Chatham Island itself, if that kind of gives you a general idea of kind of where we're talking. So that's kind of where they're kind of based and where they are. They're only found on those two islands now, Mangere and Rangatira. And we'll talk a bit about, kind of how that all worked and that kind of stuff as well in a little bit. So what kind of habitat did they have? What kind of, we know they're on these islands, but like what kind of areas did they prefer? Obviously they're not preferring places like deserts, or they don't live in the sea or anything like that. So what kind of areas are they hanging around in? So they tend to favour large areas of continuous bush with a closed canopy with lots of different understory species, with edges that are enclosed by dense sheltering vegetation. And they prefer a bush that has trees with complex structure, mixed height and age, which offers lots of nesting and foraging opportunities. So there's a lot of big words there, and there's a lot of really technical shit in there. What does that all mean? Basically, it means that they're needy. They need lots of, complex and different things. They need a very specific area. They need specifically quite well-developed bush, which is obviously hard to come by because well-developed bush takes years to grow. So, they're actually they require quite a bit. They're quite a needy species in that regard. So habitat is actually quite a difficult thing to come by for them, because they really need those, variations and complexity and that kind of stuff in where they live, and a lot of shelter and that kind of thing as well, because these are very windswept islands on top of all that. So, they need quite a thick amount of shelter to block those those winds from getting into their nests and that kind of stuff. And so we talked a little bit about population before, but in terms of what their population is looking like now, there was a census done before the breeding season in October of 2011 that counted 281 birds. Mangere Island had 47, and there were at least 234 adults that were on Rangatira Island. So that's 234 on Rangatira, 47 on Mangere, roughly. The population probably stands at around 300 individuals, give or take. It does fluctuate, seasonally based on various factors. So, they're probably sitting at, probably just under 300 individuals at any given point, which is still pretty shit. Again, in the grand scheme of things, that's still really bad. But, up from 7, that's pretty good. So, it's silver linings and all that, but it is, it is not, they're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. So there is still a lot of work to do. And there are some things that are really hindering them as well that we'll talk about in a bit, as to kind of what is going to make it difficult and what has made it difficult to bring this species back to a point where, they don't have to be as quite intensely managed. And so how does the breeding work? Here we go, here's the bird sex. Unfortunately, it's not quite as interesting as the hee-hee from last year, but these guys are interesting in that they are monogamous and that they may mate for life. Again, which is another point that's going to be important in a second. And they will often return to the same breeding site as well, which is kind of neat. And they breed annually in spring and summer, so around about this time of year if you're listening to this at time of release. And they have these kind of cup-like nests that are built in tree cavities or dense vines, usually about 2 meters from the ground, which is really good that they're all the way up there. It means that they're just a little bit less likely to be hit by, mice and that kind of, and rats and that kind of thing, because, they have to climb up the trees, and that means that, if the rat has to do more effort to get up the tree, they're just that little bit less likely to actually get up there and get into the nest. But, of course, they do forage and feed on the ground, as we talked about before. So that is, a disadvantage there, because then the bird is right there and the rat can just go straight for them. But at least in this case, their nests are quite high up. So it means that rats are potentially less likely to get at them. But, don't take that to mean that rats never will attack their nests. Absolutely. Rats are very capable of climbing. They absolutely will have a go at them. And so they have clutches of about two eggs or thereabouts. It depends on the year and various factors, fecundity, all that kind of stuff. But basically, they have on average about 2 eggs every clutch. And only the female incubates the eggs, so only the female sits on them, but both sexes care for the young. So basically the male kind of just buggers off during the bit where the female has to sit on the eggs. He's not interested in that, but as soon as the kids come out of the egg, he's like, oh yeah, better come back and help out the missus or whatever. So they do raise the young together. And pairs are capable of raising 2 clutches per season. They do have that ability, but they usually don't. They usually only raise 1. So potentially that's in case they lose one of the clutches. Then they do have the ability to raise another one to at least give them that. At least that means that they've raised some young and they've actually bred and that kind of stuff. If they do lose one clutch, potentially, I'm not sure. And once a clutch is raised to adulthood, they'll usually be kicked out of the territory, but they do tend to have a long parental investment in a few offspring, which is typical of related birds. Basically what that means is that they tend to... there's this kind of idea of kind of parental investment where you've kind of got 2 extreme ends of the scale where on one end you've got parents that give birth to the child and then just leave them. They do nothing. They pop them out and then just go, right, man, you're on your own. Don't want anything to do with you. See you later. On the other end of the spectrum, you also have species that have a lot of parental investment. In the case of the black robin here, where they put a lot of time and a lot of effort into the young to ensure that they grow up and then are capable of defending themselves and foraging for themselves and that kind of stuff when they eventually leave in this case, the nest. The difference kind of in those strategies is that on the one where you don't have a lot of parental investment, they generally have a high amount of offspring at any one time. So think things like fish and that kind of stuff. They will generally have quite a high amount of offspring, or insects will also do a similar thing as well, where they just basically have hundreds, possibly even thousands of offspring, and a good majority of those are gonna die. But it doesn't matter because the ones there will be ones that do survive. But it means that you don't have to put a lot of effort into all of those offspring because you've basically hedged your bets, right? If you've got 100, you've got 100 babies, chances are, 10 of them are probably going to survive, and that's good, with no effort from you. And then, and that strategy works, whereas the other strategy generally involves fewer offspring. So, sometimes even just one. Swans are quite capable, quite famous, for that as well, where they only tend to have 1 or 2, offspring kind of every season. But they put a lot of parental investment in that. Same with the black robin. They only get 2 eggs, roughly, and they put a high amount of investment into those 2 eggs to ensure, that they do survive all the way through to adulthood so that they can fend for themselves and feed themselves and all that kind of stuff. And although you do find animals at both of those ends, but you find more often than not, most kind of sit somewhere kind of in the middle-ish, leaning one way or the other to those strategies. So for the black robin, they tend to lean a bit more heavily onto the, fewer offspring but higher parental investment. But unfortunately, these guys do have a low reproductive output due to inbreeding depression, which is something that we'll talk about in a second. But basically, inbreeding depression is a fancy way of saying inbreeding. They are quite closely related, so therefore they have the genetic kind of issues that comes with that. So, as history nerds, you will know that the Habsburgs are quite the famous kind of they're kind of the poster child for incest, if you will, where, you know, they got that quite distinctive Habsburg chin, or the Habsburg jaw, that, you know, was very, or has become very kind of famous for incest and, you know, genetic deformities and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, but of course not all genetic deformities or not all genetic issues relating to incest are visual. So these guys do have quite a high amount of inbreeding depression that is not necessarily visually obvious, but it is all the same still quite a large problem. So as I said, they do have a low reproductive output, and in fact it is the lowest of any known oceanic Petrioca species. So it's pretty bad. It's not very good. So of course one of the not so obvious results of inbreeding depression is a low reproductive output. And again, all of this kind of stuff, all this stuff around the lower reproductive output and all the other problems that they're having is all down to that inbreeding depression. So let's talk a bit about what kind of threats that these guys face, because they do, they are a bit more extinction prone due to that low population and that low reproductive output, as well as the specialised foraging habits, the narrow tolerances for habitat type and quality, and their limited ability to disperse. So again, we've kind of already covered a lot of that stuff. Obviously the low population, reproductive output, but the specialised foraging habits, they only eat insects, and only insects of a certain size, and they have those narrow tolerances. They don't tend to, they need quite complex and quite well-developed forest to actually live in. And it needs to be quite a high quality and quite complex. And of course, they live on islands, so their ability to disperse is not that good when you compare it to, say, the North or the South Island, which has a lot of different habitats and that kind of stuff, and a lot of land mass that could be potentially spread to. These guys have only got, that small group of islands. And these, all of this is stuff that generally only these guys are dealing with. And of course, on top of that, they're dealing with all the other usual things that every other native species and endemic species in New Zealand is dealing with. So things like introduced mammalian predators, habitat destruction, and all that kind of stuff. So, all of these pressures are made that much more impactful because of these extra issues that the robin is dealing with. And as such, it basically majorly hinders its recovery. And so, on top of all of that, of course, they have that chronic inbreeding, which is related to some of that stuff from before, which has been occurring for, more than a century nearly. So it's also gives a huge loss in genetic diversity, which means that the species is less resilient. So kind of what that means is that, they don't have a lot of, so if we look at like diseases, which is, kind of on the nose, kind of topical right now, is, some people will be slightly more resistant or slightly less resistant to certain diseases for various reasons. One of the ones you hear a lot, one of the classic examples, is sickle cell anemia. People who have sickle cell anemia, which is is quite a bad disease, they are immune to malaria. Due to the way that malaria kind of works and that kind of stuff. But you can have people who have, half sickle cell anemia and half not sickle cell anemia, and they don't get as much of the bad stuff from sickle cell, but they are resistant to malaria. I guess it's not a great example, but what I'm trying to get across is that certain people have, certain individuals in any population, usually have more or less resistance to diseases for genetic and other various reasons. But if you don't have a lot of genetic diversity, because you're all quite related, because you're engaging in a lot of incestuous type breeding, then you lose a lot of that genetic diversity. You lose a lot of that ability for the population to be resilient against diseases, to be, if a disease sweeps through the black robin population and it's one that they're not resistant to, it'll wipe out basically all of them, because they've all got very similar DNA. So that's kind of what that's about. I don't feel like I've described that very well or explained it very well, but hopefully it kind of makes sense. But yeah. And because of all this inbreeding and that kind of stuff, it means that the black robin has the highest degree of relatedness of any recorded avian species in the wild. So in the world, anywhere. They have the highest degree of relatedness, the most related, which is, again, that genetic diversity is not very good. So given all of that kind of stuff, the long-term persistence of the species is pretty unclear. We don't really know how well they're going to survive into the future without that, species management and that kind of stuff. And so going back to those kind of original populations, they were, basically what happened to them before they got transferred and that kind of stuff, and the reason that they declined so quickly was generally down to basically that they were being eaten by cats and coyote, so the Pacific rat. And there is also issues with mice and apparently starlings as well. I'm not sure quite why starlings would be an issue for them, but I believe it's potentially down to food competition. So starlings were eating the same food that the robins were eating, so therefore they were out competing them. Not quite sure on that one, but that seems like a logical thing that would happen. So because of the cats, the coyote were eating them, the mice and the starlings were out competing them, that really threatened the population viability. And in fact, one population was also eliminated by destruction and decline in quality of habitat alone. So ignoring all the mice and the cats and everything else that's going on, one population was eliminated just because basically the trees were cut down. Again, because they need that complex forestry to live in, So that's was really unfortunate. And now, long periods of farming on Mangere and Rangatira have reduced the amount of suitable forest available for them to live. So it's now 8 hectares, down from 113 hectares on Mangere, and 110 hectares, down from 218 on Rangatira. So, each island lost about 100 hectares of viable forest for these guys to live in due to that, long periods of farming. Again, which is quite unfortunate. So let's talk about some other random behaviour stuff. They're often attracted to human presence, generally because of a similar reason to why the fantail or the pi waka waka follows people and that kind of stuff, is because when you're running along or walking along through the bush, you're generally kicking up leaf litter and that kind of stuff, which overturns bugs and that kind of thing that the robin wants to eat. So they're following you around to see if you stir up any bugs and things that it might want to have a bit of a go at. And so they breed, forage, and socialize almost exclusively within forest interiors, which is something that no other Petrioca species in temperate Oceania does. Which I find an interesting statement, because there probably isn't really any other Petrioca species in temperate Oceania other than the ones in New Zealand. I don't think any of the Pacific Islands would be classed as temperate. They're probably more classed as tropical. So, find that an interesting statement, but it basically means that no other Petrioca species in New Zealand do, that basically breed, forage, and socialize in those forest interiors. And they tend to be pretty reluctant to venture out from the forest, and they don't breed well in fragmented bush. Basically, if there's, you've got an area of bush, and then to get to the next bush, there is like a farm, or an area of open plain, or in this case, the sea, because it's a bunch of islands. So, yeah. So barriers and things that fracture the forest, including things like grass and open sea, really make this a lot more difficult. This means that colonization of detached habitat is slow to occur. So you should probably stress that using the word colonizing and colonization in a zoological context is different to that of a historical context. It doesn't have a lot of those negative connotations and that kind of stuff, because basically what it means, the birds are going to another area and establishing a population in another area, which is effectively what colonization is when you strip away most of everything else that's associated with it. It means one group leaving a population to start another population in another place, is effectively what that means. And interestingly, they have a patriarchal social system based on territories, kind of as we talked about before, which are defended aggressively during the breeding season, which you can probably guess why that is. And they're, quite often always alert and active, and they move around in kind of brief and direct flights from kind of branch to branch. In terms of how long they live, males tend to live about 4.2 years on average, and the females live about 3.7 years on average. But a very small number of either sex can reach ages of up to 14 years, with old age considered to be about 11 years. So it does sound like that they can live for 10 years longer than their average life cycle, or their average lifespan. But I find this particular statistic a bit dubious, because that is potentially based off a single individual, a very important individual that we're going to talk about in a second, but that doesn't seem to be potentially based on a wide amount of animals or a wide amount of robins actually living to that age. So I'm not really sure as to whether that's an actual statistic that they've found that it does occasionally happen, or whether it was just this one freak bird that just tended to live for a really long time. I'm not sure, but I do find I do have a slight issue with that statistic without further research. Talking of research, let's talk about their research and recovery. And as I said before, this is obviously this is the big thing. This is the really big story about robins or black robins and like everything about them. Like, this is the thing that everyone knows about what they are. So, as we mentioned before, after the population was moved to Mangere in 1976, 2 more birds had died sometime in the next 4 years. And of all the birds that were left, none of them had bred. But there was one breeding pair. And that's the important part. There was one breeding pair, because again, remember, these guys are monogamous and occasionally do mate for life. So that was really important. But unfortunately, because of, everything that was, there was only 5 individuals, one breeding pair, the likelihood of recovery was basically 0. They were not very hopeful that it was basically only a matter of time before they became extinct. However, there was a team from the New Zealand Wildlife Service, which is basically the predecessor to the modern Department of Conservation, that made a last-ditch effort to basically bring the species back. And what they did is they took the eggs from Old Blue, who was the female, and Old Yellow, who was the male. So they took the eggs and gave them to the Chatham Island tomtits to basically foster and raise them, which essentially boosted the productivity of Old Blue and Old Yellow. So basically, if they took the eggs away, the robins could breed again, produce more eggs, and then those eggs could be taken away and given to another tomtit pair to foster and raise, and then, so on and so forth. And this essentially saved the species. This is really what did it, is taking those eggs and getting those other tomtits to foster them, which was just amazing. Like, it's genius, is what I'm getting at. It's genius. And so the population was large enough in 1983 to move them to Rangatira Island from Mangere Island, which is where they were currently. And by which point the total population was about 80 individuals, so 80. And it was at this time that intensive management stopped in 1983, but a high amount of monitoring was still occurring up until 1999, when the population had reached about 200 individuals, and then monitoring was scaled back to allow for work on other species. You've only got a certain amount of money and a certain amount of time and that kind of stuff to invest, so it seemed like they were doing pretty okay, so the monitoring was scaled back. And so another attempt to establish a population occurred between sort of 2001 and 2005 in a fenced area on Pitt or Aotearoa Island, which saw about 40 birds move to an area that was surrounded by a predator-proof fence. Which, if you're not quite sure what that is, if you go to the Hans YouTube channel, you'll see when I go to Zealandia, I talk a little bit about the predator-proof fence there, and I show it to you as well. So if you kind of want to know a bit more about that, you can go see that there. But basically, it's a big fence that stops predators getting in. Makes sense. So unfortunately, this failed, as the last bird that was in there, who was named Spike, he disappeared in 2009. And the reason that this basically failed is not really well understood. It seems like the area they were moved to wasn't cleared of mice, and this may have meant that they were competing for the same food sources, which basically mice outdid them at, kind of as we talked about with the starlings before. So this is, so as I said, that's the big, in a nutshell, I guess. There's obviously a lot going on there that I've skipped over, but in a nutshell, that is the big story behind the Chatham Island robin, is the story with, the two single breeding pair, and they just pumping out eggs, and they giving them to, dock officers, or wildlife service people, giving them to the eggs to the tomtits and allowing them to raise them and that kind of stuff, which is, just amazing. And the thing I didn't mention before was that the individual who lived for the 14 years was Old Blue, was the female. And you hear a lot about Old Blue when you're talking about Chatham Island black robins and that kind of stuff. Old Blue is the poster child, I guess. She is the, everyone knows who Old Blue, the name of Old Blue. Everyone knows Old Blue. There's pictures of Old Blue. There's, Old Blue is the Mary, when it, married to the Jesus of, of robins, right? She gives birth to the saviors of the species or whatever, even though she is kind of the savior of the species, but you get what I mean. But, Old Yellow kind of gets a bad rap. Well, not a bad rap, but, he's kind of the Joseph. He just kind of gets forgotten. Old Blue is the Mary, she gave birth to Jesus, and then there's also a male who was also involved. But look at the female, which is like, I don't know. I just thought it was funny. I'd never heard of Old Yellow before. At least I didn't know what the male's name was. But I knew Old Blue. I've always heard about Old Blue. So I don't know. I kind of feel bad for Old Yellow. He's out there doing work too. And he's not getting the recognition he deserves. So, not trying to disparage Old Blue. Old Blue, double thumbs up. Bloody good on you. Solid effort. But Old Yellow, I think you need some recognition as well. So paki to Old Yellow and Old Blue for really putting in the work of shagging each other to bring back a species. Bloody good on you. Oh man, good lord. Anyway, in terms of modern recovery, this involves quarantine of populations from predators, pathogens, and habitat loss. So just like if you're listening to this at time of release, just like what some of you are doing now, they're quarantined from, things being brought in, and in terms of like, mice and rats and stoats, as well as, diseases and all that kind of stuff. It just so happens that their quarantine involves an entire island as opposed to just your house, And so genetic health as well is maintained through increasing population size. There's no real way to increase genetic diversity, which is what they mean by genetic health. You just kind of have to manage them as best you can, and really hope that the species will, get enough mutations and stuff that the genetic health will kind of increase and the diversity will increase over time. It's easier to do that with kakapo because there was a very small population to start with, and they manage that population of who breeds with who to ensure that the diversity still is maintained. However, with obviously the robins, they're all descended from the same breeding pair. So there's not as much you can do about that because you don't have, say, 10 individuals that you can swap around and breed with, each other at various times and all that kind of stuff to ensure that people who are too closely related or birds that are too closely related aren't mating with each other. You can't really do that with the robins because they're all descended from the same pair. So they're a bit shafted in that regard. But they basically just need to increase population size, and that'll help with keeping that genetic health and diversity. And extinction will be reduced by translocating birds to new habitats within the Chathams to establish new populations and planting new trees to create habitat. So obviously translocating birds, if you've listened to the Richard Henry episode that I did with History A podcast, I talked a lot about how Richard Henry is the guy who pioneered that technique of translocating birds, which is the kind of bread and butter of Doc's arsenal or toolkit today. So that's still a big thing, is translocating birds to new habitats, and as I said, planting new trees to create new habitat, again because those birds require that complex and well developed habitat. And This has meant that they have now planted over 100,000 trees over the last 30 years. But the kind of problem is that it takes time for those trees to grow, especially when they're being battered by the winds all the time, being on a windswept island and all that kind of stuff. And again, they need that complex forest, they need that well-developed forest, so it's not like they can just plant some trees and there they go. They have to wait for those trees to grow, and that just takes a really long time. As well as, of course, what also helps is the strict biosecurity regulations that DOC has in place around the islands. I wasn't able to find what those specific regulations are, but based on my past experience, it'll be things like no boat landings, you've got to check all your bags for seeds and mice and rats and all that kind of stuff. Which does happen. People do, find things in their bags and that kind of stuff. I actually had the ranger who was on Matiu Soames Island when I went out there. He said somebody had brought in a brand new sleeping bag. They literally just bought it that day from Kathmandu or whatever. Kathmandu is a shop in New Zealand. I don't know if that's the same as everywhere else, but it's a hiking shop basically, or an outdoors shop. Anyway, they brought this brand new sleeping bag, and the person refused to open it up and basically tip it out, which is what you have to do. You have to empty your bag, tip everything out, and just make sure that there's nothing in it, or there's no rats or mice or anything else that they don't want, or seeds of exotic plants. And she didn't want to do it, and the ranger was like, look, just humour me, just pull it out, just pull everything out, just let me see, and we'll be good. So she did that, and they found 2 mice in there who had gnawed their way or crawled their way into it in the shop. So you never know what may happen. But yeah, so that's probably the kind of things that they're doing is, no boat landings. You've got to check all your bags. You've got to scrub your feet of any dirt or seeds or anything like that, which is all very typical stuff of predator-free islands around the country. And so monitoring of populations is also still done, even though it was scaled back. And it used to indicate that population was declining for some reason, but they couldn't really figure out why. And it seems that they may have not been sampling enough. So instead, one of the ways they increased their sampling was to present mealworms to the robins to get them to come to them when the people walked into their territory, which obviously makes it easier. If the robin comes to you, it's easy to count them. You can just see them, see their bands on their legs, and go, yep, that's that one, cool. However, this method is quite labour intensive. You actually got to go out there and present the mealworms and wait for them to come to you and stuff. And I'm guessing there's repeats of the same birds coming to grab mealworms off you again and again. So it is quite labour intensive, and it apparently takes a few years before the population will actually trust humans enough to actually take the handouts. So it's not something that you can just go out and do kind of on a whim. It is something that does require quite a bit of investment and time and quite a bit of willpower and of course money to do, because you've got to get people out there, and unless you're using volunteers, you've got to pay them. And you got to, regardless of whether you're using volunteers or paid personnel, you have to feed them and house them and all that kind of stuff as well. So we don't like talking about money, but money is a factor when it comes to things like this. And that's pretty much all the information I've got for this roughly hour-long episode about the Chatham Island black robin. So the black robin, of course, does have a recovery plan, which can be found on DOC's website, but I'll also put a link to that in the show notes as well, if you're a huge nerd and you want to read that. It's all pretty, the sort of stuff you would expect from a recovery program. So that's pretty much it. So hopefully you will give the Chatham Island black robin your vote this year when it comes to the Bird of the Year award. I think it's a really interesting animal. It's obviously got a great story behind it, and it's extremely endangered. And I think giving more, because there is a real world effect from these as well. It's not just a fun. It is a fun kind of dumb thing that we do every year, because why not? But it does have kind of real world impacts by one bird winning the Bird of the Year award. It does increase their exposure, and it does increase the amount of donations that people may get towards their recovery and that kind of thing. So, it does have a real world impact, even if it is just minor, in that it gives more exposure and then people want to, try and save them a bit more and that kind of stuff. So it is, so hopefully, you do give these guys, a bit of your vote, because they are a great species, and, I think, it'd be really cool to bring back more of them. But I guess, there is kind of one, before we go fully out, there's one kind of thing that I have missed a little bit, which is the Chatham Island black robin does present or it is kind of part of this, argument's not quite the right word, discussion, on whether we should be saving individual species that basically have no hope of coming back. So generally things like the Chatham Island black robin or the kakapo are kind of pointed to in terms of, like, we invest a lot of money, particularly kakapo at the moment, we invest a lot of money into bringing these species back when there are hundreds, possibly thousands of species that are facing similar problems that we don't pour as much money into. And a lot of the reason for that is because they're not cute, fluffy looking things that the public really likes, and that are really easily marketable, essentially. And so the question becomes, should we be putting all this money into individual species that potentially have very little ecological value, in terms of they aren't like a key species in the food web, or a key species in a habitat or a particular area or anything like that. They're just kind of there. All species are important, obviously, to the food chain and to the ecology of an area, but some are obviously more important than others. That's just how it works. And so should we be putting all this money into saving these individual species? It's, there's not any clear answer to this. It obviously is possible. We can do it, as evidenced by the black robin and the kakapo. It's not impossible. We can absolutely do it. But the question is that where we want to be putting our money? Is that where we want to be putting our resources, our effort, our time, everything else, our political willpower, everything, our brain power, all of that stuff, our research? Is that where we want to be putting it? There's no clear answer. There's no necessarily wrong answer, but it is a question that has been asked before, and is perhaps something that we should ask in future. But for now, hopefully you will give your vote to the Chatham Island black robin. So if you are, as mentioned earlier, if you are interested in more of these kind of episodes on birds and other species, I do talk a little bit about them in the Patreon episodes. So for anyone who is a $5 or above donator, you can get access to those episodes as well. We talk about this, or stuff like this. We also, I have started a series where me and my brother review New Zealand movies, and we talk about it a bit. The first one, we've only got one up at the moment because it's a bit difficult at the moment trying to align our schedules to record, but the one we have got is The World's Fastest Indian, which is one that is quite close to us personally, because it was made in the city that we're from, and about a guy from the city that we're from, and we just fucking rip it to shreds. Which is probably not the greatest look, but we do that. And I do have things planned down the line as well. Eventually, I'm hoping to do one on the kind of geography of New Zealand, because it has been requested in the past, and I do realise that some of you, when I talk about places like Taranaki, Golden Bay, the Uruwiras and that kind of stuff, you probably don't know where those are. It probably doesn't mean much to you if you're not from New Zealand. So just doing a bit of a, look, here's where this is, and this is kind of where everything kind of looks, and here's where the main population centres are, and how many people live there, and whatever else I can kind of think of. But just kind of generally an idea of what each area is, kind of where each area is, where the major stuff is, and other random bits and bobs, just so you kind of have a general overview of where stuff is, because of course as we go further into, or at least when Europeans turn up and start settling and that kind of stuff, the city names are going to start cropping up as well, and it's going to become a bit more important to know those sorts of areas and kind of vaguely where those areas are, especially when we start talking about wars and troop movements and that kind of stuff as well. So if you are interested in donating to the podcast, either because you want to get access to other stuff that I do, or you just want to donate to the podcast because you're a good person and you just want to support what Hans is about, please do so. There will be a link in the show notes to it as well. But with that, I think we will cut off this extremely long episode and leave it there. So, as always, haere tu atu, hoki tu mai. See you next time.